In this section, the main goal, the main aim is for you to be in a position to understand the risk mitigation strategies in supply chain. Now, being in a position to understand what risks are, how to assess them, won't really be enough, if you can't come up with mitigation strategies, or even if you can't come up with strategies to take care of them, which is the reason why by the time you're done with all these, you're going to be in a position to identify the use of probability and impact assessment to manage risk in supply chains, analyze risk assessment and risk register to mitigate risks in supply chain, explain the development of risk management culture and strategy to improve supply chains, as well as compare strategic approaches to mitigate risks in supply chain. So let's jump right into all of those ones. Now let's start with identifying the use of probability and impact assessment to manage risks in supply chain. Supply chain management enables you to plan better for efficient, effective, and continuous supply of goods and services. And what that means is that you're going to be in a better position to actually identify the risks associated with your entire supply chain and then plan for those particular risks, because these are events that sometimes they come up and they mess everything in the supply chain. So by understanding supply chain management, then you're not only just knowing how to take care of upstream and downstream activities, you also know, how to handle the risk associated with the entire flow. Take something like the war that happened in Sudan between Al Burhana and Hemeti. Now, the first thing you need to know is that Sudan is actually placed the way they are, They're geographically placed in a position where they can compromise the operations that happen in the Suez Canal. And speaking of Suez Canal, the thing you have to understand is that anything that affects the operation of the Suez Canal will affect about 10% of the world's trade route. And speaking of trade, most of the things, in fact, everything that you see around you, be it a phone, a laptop, whatever it is, it got there somehow through some logistic process, which means from the manufacturer to where you actually bought it, there are some shipment involved, there are things of that nature. So that just tells you that supply chain kind of just affects everything, Now, still on the Suez Canal, but in this case, the recent ship attacks, on the Red Sea, which had its, political reasons, which just went something along the lines of that country attacked that other country and now we are retaliating because of God, because of whatever, I really don't care which side you take, because my point here is just supply chain. So looking at that, those, ship attacks at the Red Sea, which is still part of, those ships will still go all the way to Suez Canal, right? So if you look at that, the Houthis and all that stuff, right? So what is happening here? They have implications, business implications, especially since now 7 out of top 10 biggest commercial companies are considering longer routes for their shipment, and such costs get passed down the supply chain. So what is the point of all that? What is the point of talking about problems at the Suez Canal? What is the point in talking about, the Red Ship attacks? The point is, all that just proves that with globalization, supply chains are just increasingly becoming risky, In short, the risks associated with supply chains are increasing. And what that means to you is that you need to be in a position to effectively identify risks that are going to be part of the supply chain you're dealing with. And you also not only just identify them, you need to be in a position to, identify, figure out the probability of that thing happening, figure out the impact if that thing happens, and come up with either a plan for that particular risk or an entire plan, for your business if those things end up affecting your business. The process starts by identifying the risks that exist in relation to an organization's output. And from a larger perspective, from a larger point of view, all these risks can be divided into two broader categories. We have internal risks, all which are still associated with the supply chain, and we have external risks. So let's talk about those. Internal risks in this case will include things like lack of availability of personnel, because having or not having enough employees. In fact, having employees, but then they are not knowledgeable, or experts on something, or even not having enough employees, will still affect your business. I mean, think of it this way. During the festive, okay, if you're in a business where there is peak, okay, like the rush where people shop and all that stuff, like the festive seasons. So if you don't have enough employees at that point, you see, that's a problem because you have goods which are not moving. And the same thing can just be said about not having experts, okay? Like if your business is, cyber security, whatever, sensitive, and then you don't have experts to deal with things like cyber attacks. So again, in that case, you are still at risk, and this risk is internal. Why? Because you are lacking the proper personnel to handle those sort of things. Number 2, lack of availability of machines and machine breakdowns. So not having the machine, or even having machines and still it breaks down, that can still affect you. So in this case, you're talking about things like a production machine for manufacture, a ventilator for hospital providing emergency services. I mean, if you recall during the pandemic, the 2020 thing, one of the problems that most hospitals were having were either they ran out of oxygen or they don't have enough ventilators. So that was a big issue. Another problem that can occur in relation to machines and breakdowns will be a server, okay, for a broadband service provider crashes and then that has an issue. Like, okay, this is not really server related, but CrowdStrike, okay, the company CrowdStrike. A few weeks ago, they had some issues. So again, those are issues to do with machines, right? Number 3, fraud committed by procurement and supply chain employees. And the thing you have to understand is that fraud can occur at pretty much any point in the supply chain. And so in this case, we're talking about things like during the allocation of procurement contracts to suppliers, when payments are made to suppliers in the form of bribes, all of which can have an impact on the procurement. I mean, think about things that happen during government tendering processes, okay? So most governments tend to use the cash accounting because they collect revenue, they use it this year, next year they're going to collect revenue, right? And they're going to use it as per the budget or their finance bill or whatever it is, right? And so how do you explain a situation where somebody supplies something and then they're told, well, we're not in a position to pay you? And if you look at most government procurement, blah, blah, blah act, okay? So whichever way you call it in your country, you'll realize that there's always some provision there which will say that don't tender for anything if you don't have money. So the Treasury or the Federal Reserve, whichever name you call it in your country, is not going to allow them to just do tenders if they don't have money to finance those things. So then how do you explain suppliers supplying and not being paid? So all these are just corrupt things that happen within those organizations. So fraud and corruption. So now to test your understanding of internal risks in procurement, here's a practical application that I want you to look at and then see if you can find an answer to. Let's assume that a company called ABC Dairies, which is a producer of milk and dairy products for a cooperative of dairy farmers in your area. The dairy has a 150-acre site where around 1,500 cows are reared to produce milk for products such as cheese and ice cream. Now the farm has different areas for grazing, milking, rearing, okay, an area for cows that require medical attention, and finally a factory where cheese and ice cream is made. Now in the past, the farm has had problems like mad cow disease, cows being infected by mastitis, lack of hay due to supply issues in the winter, equipment breakdown, delays in picking up milk from the farm. Now, with all that in mind, here's what I want you to do. So here's the practical part where you're supposed to test your knowledge, okay? Remember, all these one is just connected to internal risks, okay, in supply chain. So construct a list of internal risks that the farm is facing. Yeah, so write that one down. See if you understand what you mean by internal risks. Remember, we talked about those things, machine breakdown and all that stuff, right? So come up with the sort that you think could be relating to this particular farm. And if you have any question, you can always ask, right? So let's move on to the next one. External and other sources of risk. External sources of risk in this case are just supply side risks. Okay, these are risks that will come from outside your business and for the most part, the suppliers. So the risks that arise in connection with the organization that are involved in the supply of materials or service to the business. So your supplier's issues, in this case, the supplier has a problem, and that problem moves all the way, depending on which tier the supplier is, then it gets to you. Toyota having issues with the supply of semiconductors, Apple having supply issues since they rely on China and Taiwan, and that all China-US tension, all those are examples of external related or external type of supply chain risks. In fact, things like the Red Sea crisis, the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, Iran, seizing an Israeli cargo ship, increasing tension over Taiwan, US imposed tariffs on China imports, all those ones are going to affect businesses, All those ones are going to affect companies, all those are going to affect businesses that do business with suppliers in any of those areas. And ignoring those extreme sort of tensions, the political and all that stuff, you still have risks such as machine failure, industrial strike, environmental factor. So the point is, if the supplier's machine breaks down, then that's going to trickle down all the way to you, right? So just saying supply side risks are mostly going to be your external risks. Taking all these into account, it is essential that the external risk for each supplier or group of items are evaluated as part of risk assessment exercise. Once this evaluation has taken place, the procurement team can identify whether risks are internal or external in nature, and whether they will get worse based on the decision made or not. So that is the thing you need to know there, Like, yes, we are having a problem with that country. What does that mean to us as far as, the suppliers in that country are concerned? Do we do something, or will it just get better with time? As we move along, you're going to see some of the risk mitigation strategies that company can choose from, because there are moments when you just tolerate a risk, Of course, there are moments where you treat it. There are moments where you just look at it and decide, you know what, this one we need to totally avoid, which actually means not even doing that project or not doing business with those people at all. So that's the thing, external risks. So in the spirit of learning by doing, let's test your knowledge, your understanding of external risks. And in this case, let's assume that you're part of this company called Plastic Corp, which is a producer of large plastic products which are used on roads such as cones and road dividers. The factory is located in Melbourne, Australia. Now the factory buys plastic pellets mainly from large Chinese suppliers, and it buys machineries from Singapore. Currency fluctuations have meant that machineries from Singapore has been expensive. In addition to this, the Singaporean manufacturer charges a premium due to the difference in units of measurement. Regulations state that the imperial system, FPS, of measurement must be used. Transportation from Singapore is often delayed due to the congestion at the port during peak period. And the Chinese suppliers faces several problems due to lack of electricity, bad roads, and a poor internet connection. And so, looking at that information, so based on that information, here's what I want you to do. Again, the practical aspect, Identify the various sources of risks to the plastic manufacturer from these two suppliers. And in this case, what are you doing? You're just looking at external risks. So you are the buyer, those are your suppliers, some of the issues that they're having. So what sort of risks are those issues posing to your business? So look at it that way. And then you'll understand that all those risks are going to be external. I mean, they will affect you, but they're coming from an external source. So that makes it external risks. So again, learning by doing, try that, and then we move on. Now let's do a quick summary of identifying risks and its impact in the organization. So again, remember that in as much as this is just a summary, we're going to look at all these in detail as we continue with the, with the videos. Now, the first thing that happens here will be establishing the context. In this case, looking at your circumstances, where you're operating. Is it global? Is it local? What is your business context? Because a business that has manufacturers in pretty much all over the country doesn't have the sort of risks that a business that just sources locally and deals with local suppliers you love. I mean, some of these things are going to change. So the first thing is figure out the context in which you're operating into. Number 2, identify risks. So with the context in mind, the question here becomes, along that supply chain, which areas, do risks exist in? Is it a shipping problem, like in the case where your ship is probably going to be attacked? And could that mean rerouting the ship? Is it a routing problem? Like the example you used, the Suez Canal. Is that the problem? So you identify the risks. Number 3, in this case, number 3. Analyze risk. So risk analysis. And this way you're going to look at those risks in terms of the impact they're going to have, as well as the likelihood of occurring, or the likelihood and the impact. It doesn't matter really. You're going to analyze the risks so that you figure out which one is severe and which one isn't. Next, evaluate the risks. And so based on your analysis, here's where you're going to come up with your strategies, the risk mitigation strategy. Again, look, this is just a summary. You're going to look at all those in details, but the key thing is, as you continue, you need to have all these in mind. And next, treat risks. So if you realize that you're dealing with risks that cannot be eliminated, avoided, or transferred, for example, geopolitical tension, then you need to come up with a protocol for dealing with those risks. So these are the part of treating the risks is, This could mean something like diversifying suppliers, diversifying supplier base, or even stock piling. And then finally, monitor and review. So it is important that risks are regularly reviewed to ensure that they are up to date, with new risk identified, analyzed, and evaluated. That's the thing with that, Again, as you continue, remember, if there is any question you ask, so you don't just sit there frustrated with your question. I mean, you can use any of the social media platforms, Facebook, X, Instagram. You can email, you can inbox depending on where you're watching this. I mean, the point is, if you're stuck at any point, you ask. Now let's move on. Now let's talk about the methodologies for assessing the probability and impact of risks. And in this case, we are starting by, we are looking at a qualitative approach. We're going to look at that. The idea being to assess these risks in terms of the probability of the risk happening, and if that risk happens, what is the impact of that risk? So that is how we are going to analyze them. And that can be shown in the following graph, where you have low, medium, and high probability, as well as low, medium, and high impact risks. Now, in this case, you can terminate risks that have high impact and probability, tolerate risks that have low impact and probability, and choose to transfer or to treat medium risks, So the ones that are medium. Looking at such kind of a graph, that's just theoretical. How about practical? So to understand this from a practical perspective, let's look at this example. Now, XYZ Electronics sources its component from various global suppliers. Meaning what? Meaning the company has, several suppliers. That's the thing, right? And all these, through their risk identification, they've sort of come up with risks, the following risks, 4 main, I mean, these are just, anyway, look, they've come up with these 4 risks. So in this case, geopolitical instability, which they've identified as risk A, natural disasters, risk B, supplier bankruptcy, let's call that one risk C, and transportation delays, which is risk D. So what is the next thing? The next thing is now we have the risks. So we need to look at these risks in terms of, are they really going to happen? And if they do, what is the probability? And number 2, yes, if they happen, what is going to be, rather, what are their impacts as far as the business is concerned? So, probability and the impact. Now, probability in this case just means the likelihood of the risk occurring. And this likelihood is going to be put on a scale of, or rather from 1 to 5, where 1 is very unlikely, and 5 is very likely. Now, the impact, which in this case is the severity of the, that risk if it occurs, how will it affect the supply chain, basically. And that one too, you're going to look at it on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is very low, the impact is very low, and 5, the impact is very high. So having done that, remember, we identified all those 4 risks, right? So having done that, we end up with a matrix that looks something like this. So we have risk, probability, and impact, and then there is the impact the probability and the impact score. So something like geopolitical stability, okay, A, in this case, the probability is 4, the impact is 5, which means it scores 20, that is, okay, multiplying those two. Natural disaster, 3 and 4, we have 12. Supplier bankruptcy, the probability is 2, so that's, and the impact if it occurs is 3, so the score in this case is 6. Transport delays, 5, impact 2, and the score is 10. Look, if you're thinking, hang on, what do those scores mean? Okay, so here's what they mean, right? Because once you look at something in terms of probability and impact, then you need to know that the one that scores the most, that is the one that you really need to be worried about, because if it happens, then you are probably going to be wiped out as far as your business is concerned. So the scores in this case is what we mean. Geopolitical instability has a high probability, okay, which indicates that it's the most critical. And then you have natural disaster, okay, the score is 12, so it's significant risks. It's significant in risk, right, but less critical than geopolitical instability. We have supplier bankruptcy, and the score is 6, making it less critical, but still worth monitoring. We have transportation delays, very high in probability, but low in impact. And so, it still has a 10, indicating that it's frequent, but less severe risks. Understanding that sort of thing, putting it in metrics, okay, putting it in a graph, it's kind of just good for presentation. But then the question is, now we have that, okay? We have the graph and everything is going up or whatever it is. What does that mean to us? It's time for you to come up with a strategy. So in case of geopolitical instability, what are some of the things you can do? One, you can diversify the supplier base to reduce the reliance on high-risk regions. You can establish contingency plan and increase inventory levels for critical components. You can engage in active monitoring of geopolitical developments. Regarding something like natural disaster, what are you going to do about that? So in this case, your options could be, among other options, okay, so we're just coming up with a few options. So they could include things like develop relationship with multiple suppliers across different geographical regions, okay, invest in risk management tools to predict and mitigate the impact of natural disaster, implement robust disaster recovery plans. Speaking of disaster recovery plans, that is something that we're also going to look at as we continue. So these are just things that you're mentioning, and then as we continue, because by the time you're done with all these, you'll also have a disaster recovery plan template, or at least have an idea of how one is developed. Now, the other one, in this case, was supplier bankruptcy. So in that case, conduct regular financial health assessment of key suppliers, establish contracts with secondary suppliers to ensure continuity of supply, maintain buffer stocks to cover short-term disruptions, okay? Something like transportation delay, what do you do in that case? Well, you optimize logistics and explore alternative transportation routes, okay? Which is something like, remember the first example we started with, okay? The issues to do with the Red Seas. Actually, the first example was the Suez Canal. But regarding the Red Sea issues, which is currently a problem after the excuse that is being used is we are targeting companies that ally with, the businesses that ally with like the Israel, Gaza, Palestine, all that stuff. So that's kind of just the reason why all that is happening, right? So in case of something like that, okay, so the shipping, the companies that are using that route are opting to, instead of going through the Suez, how about we just go all the way around Africa? And you see, that's a long route. And those costs are going, what are they going to do? We'll incur the cost, then maybe we'll pass them on to the next person in the supply chain. And finally, the last person is going to be you, the buyer, anyway. Now, so that's a choice. Now, another one, use advanced tracking system to monitor shipment in real time, build flexible production schedules to accommodate potential delays. That is an example of an actual risk, okay? Like a business situation where they had a problem. They've used the qualitative method by looking at probability and impact of the risk occurring. They've done the score. They've prioritized, okay, or ranked the risks in terms of which one is most, okay, dangerous. They're all dangerous. And which one is least likely to impact us the most. And in each case, what plans do we have? Like what strategies do we have? So that's an example of that. Again, as we continue, the rule is simple. If you have a question, you ask. So let's move on to the next one. In this case, let's talk about vulnerability assessment and supply chain vulnerability. Okay, supply chain's vulnerability refers to an organization's level of exposure to disturbance to continuity of operations that arise from supply chain risks. So for example, if you are a food processing company, then you know that one of the things you're risking is that if crops are sick, okay, or if it's animals and then they have diseases, then this is going to affect your whatever it is that you're doing, unless everything that you're making there in the name of food is just synthetic and you are whatever. But the point is, that's a risk and that's an area in which you are vulnerable. Supply chain vulnerability occurs as a result of the complex supply chain in terms of length, distance, weak links in the connection, and interactions between various players in the supply chain, policies, as well as technologies. Okay, etc. So all that, okay, all that is going to be the problem. Now, when you are looking at this, when you're conducting vulnerability assessment in your supply chain, don't just look at the suppliers that are the tier 1 suppliers who are like very close to you. I mean, you also want to go as far as you can. So tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. So in short, your suppliers, their suppliers, their suppliers, so that if there is a problem, then you know that, okay? You know that something happening there. I mean, think of it this way. If you look at something like upstream operations, so the farmers who are supplying, say, milk to that particular company that supplies milk to you, okay? Or the people who are supplying food to the farmers, okay, who are supplying chicken and eggs to you, then if there is a problem with the food processing companies, okay, like the animal feeds, then why won't you think that that problem is not going to get to you? Because it will get to you, right? That is something that you have to think of. You need to remember that problem is just going to come all the way to you. So that's the thing you need to remember when you're conducting these vulnerability assessment. You don't just look around you and think, yeah, well, we are good. The taxes are for those people. Those government policies are still going to be, they're still going to finally get to you. So when you're looking at those areas, some of the things you look out for will include quality, finance, security, fraud, natural diseases, and in some cases, even a merger, okay? Like some organizations merging. That can still affect you. Like, the vertical integration, right? I mean, vertical integration, not vertical. The vertical integration, right? So if animal feed company buys the animal manufacturing, whatever it is that, like they buy the suppliers that are immediately closer to you, then what makes you think that that big company is going to be nice to you because you had a good relationship with the company that they bought? So again, these are some of the things that you need to look at as far as your supply chains vulnerabilities are concerned. So I'll repeat, it's not just the suppliers closer to you, it's them and their suppliers and all the way. I mean, sometimes it even affects the downstream operation depending on how influential you are in that downstream operation. So still, these are things that you need to pay attention to. So your suppliers, their suppliers, your buyers, and their buyers. That's all part of the supply chain. So when you're looking at vulnerability, you look at all that. Collecting statistical evidence. So we've already looked at something like the qualitative, probability of something happening and the impact. Vulnerable aspects of the supply chain, that is also something that we've looked at. But then there is a question of statistics. So how does statistics help us in this case? Remember, there's a reason why you're told you have big lies, small lies, and then you have statistics. So the data is important. It will help you. Meaning what? With all the numbers that you have, because data is also important, okay? You need to look at those numbers and then make up a decision regarding the risks that you're likely to incur. And if you're wondering which numbers, don't worry, we'll come to that. So the point is that let's take something like deliveries. How many times have the suppliers failed to deliver? How many, whatever, all those stuff. Those are all data that you're going to use to arrive at a conclusion. But the key thing here, as you're going through this, the thing that you need to understand is that don't just assume that all the numbers you crunch up are important, okay? And therefore you start panicking. Previous risk events are a good place to start when reviewing what risk events may be faced in the future. But, you still have to take into account the black swan events, meaning what? Look, if all your suppliers were just doing their good job, like imagine you've looked at the data from 2019 all the way to like 2015 and they've been doing a good job. Now it's 2020, right? And then boom, pandemic. Suddenly it's a problem, right? Not in 2020, I'm just using that as an example. But the point is, there are events that can just occur and make your data look useless. So these are black swan events. How do you define them? So black swan event is an occurrence or event that is extremely unusual and therefore difficult to predict. Such kind of events will include things like global pandemics, okay, which are going to affect global distribution, demand fluctuations, labor shortage, transport challenges, etc. Now, what sort of data are you going to use when you're trying to analyze the risks, okay? And in this case, we're talking about things like financial data, invoices, logistics, okay? Logistics schedule, basically, consumer data, sales data, or even employee data. Personal experiences can also be used because sometimes somebody can say, yeah, they are late here, but I know these guys and they're going to make it up in this case. So don't just be like, no, but the numbers are the numbers. It's like, yeah, sure. But then there is also personal experience, which can also be used. That's all I'm saying. Let's look at this from a practical perspective. So in this case, you have a company called ABC Manufacturing, which makes electrical devices. And one of their key suppliers is XYZ Components, which provide critical microchips used in their products. And the thing you have to remember here is that when you're dealing with suppliers, you're going to have your key performance indicators that you're going to use to assess things like delivery, quality, all that stuff. So have that in mind. All those numbers that you get from your key performance indicators, that's data, right? So that is what you're going to use in this case. So statistical data in this case show that delivery delays in the last 12 months, so XYZ Components had an average on-time delivery rate of 85%, with delays ranging from 1 to 3 weeks. 5 out of 12 months had significant delays exceeding 2 weeks. So that is data in relation to the company's delivery, right? Remember, we need to use all this data to make up a decision. So just follow along. Next, now the defect rate for microchips from this particular company XYZ is 4% compared to an industry average of 1.5%. Out of 10,000 microchips received last quarter, 400 were defective, causing production halts and rework. You may be in a position to understand why the suppliers are having those problems, but just because you understand, okay, just because you're like, yeah, I get why they're having those problems, doesn't mean that those problems are not impacting your business. So the impacts are there. So in this case, the impacts will include things like production line delays, okay? So delays in receiving microchips led to 10% reduction in overall production capacity. And there is increased costs, like reworking defective parts and sourcing emergency supplies, increased cost by 15%. That data, remember, we were talking about what? Collating statistical data. So you look at that sort of information, and that means you have a choice. You can continue working with that supplier and then suffer those problems, or you can find a new supplier. But then if you're going to find a new supplier, you have a place to start with. In this case, you have the data. And so you want one that doesn't have the same problems that those numbers are telling you. For example, finding a supplier who has 95 on-time delivery rate. That way you reduce your production delay probability. Now, of course, other solutions like inventory buffer are also available, but you just want to keep it short and simple. So you just don't want to complicate solutions. You just want, this is a problem based on the numbers, based on everything we've looked at. And so that's a solution. That's what you want to do. Right, let's move on to the next one. In this case, the use of the use of probability theory. Okay, so probability theory is another way that you can go about predicting the chances of supply chain risks. And yeah, it just comes down to numbers. Okay, when you talk about probability, you're just talking about maths. So probability in this case, what does it refer to? Probability is an area of mathematics that enables a number to be put on the chance of expecting an outcome. Think of it this way. The simplest idea here is you have a coin. You toss it. What are the chances that you get a head? What are the chances that you get a tail? One coin, one toss, 50-50, right? Now, if you do it 3 times, then the chances, and it's not 50-50 anymore, okay? So that's what you're talking about. So the same thing can be looked at in terms of risks. In mathematical terms, probability is expressed as a fractional number between 0 and 1, with 0 being a nil chance of that thing happening, and 1 means that particular outcome is definite. So the closer you get to a whole number, okay, the closer that event is likely to occur. So if I say a probability is 0.5, that is not the same as the probability is 0.9. So you see, the closer we are moving towards the whole number, the higher the chance that that thing is likely to occur. Now, how does this work in procurement? Again, it just comes down to the data that you collected from your suppliers, for example. So they keep on failing, okay, in terms of either delivery rate, or they keep on bringing things that are defective. So if that number increases, what are the chances that they'll still continue supplying defective products? See, the number is high. So imagine a company, let's call it ABC Manufacturing, and the company relies on 3 suppliers to supply components which are very critical to the company's undertaking. The company has, in this case, reliability, okay, of delivery is important. So the company has 3 data, okay, 3 sort of data as far as these 3 suppliers are concerned. And you're talking about number 1, so supplier A has an on-time delivery rate of 95%, there is 0.95 probability. Supplier B has an on-time delivery rate of 90%, and in the case of supplier C, it's 85%, that is 0.85 probability. Holding all factors constant, what is the probability of all suppliers delivering on time? And that means quick calculations. So in this case, we're talking about the probability of all time, so we'll call that one P, okay? So P is equals to P, okay, multiplied by A times P into brackets B times P into bracket C. So the bracket just means P times A. So, and then you have 0.95 times 0.90 times 0.85, and that gives you 0.72675. So basically, you have 72.675% chance that all the 3 suppliers will deliver on time. But then there is a question of what are the chances that one of those suppliers is going to not deliver on time? Because remember, you rely on all 3 of them. So again, in this case, it's just simple math. Meaning what? Meaning the probability of at least one delay is 1 minus the probability of, the all-time delivery, right? As in all delivering on time. So in this case, you have 1 minus 0.72675. And so the chances that one of them is going to deliver late is 0.27325, meaning 27.325% chance that at least one supplier will experience delay. And what does that number mean to your business? Well, it just means based on the plans you have in place, or based on your strategy, is 27% too much for you? If it is too much, then it means you need to figure out alternatives. And that could mean increasing inventory of the critical component to buffer against delay, okay? Seeking an additional supplier with a high on-rate delivery to reduce dependency on the current suppliers, or even implementing a more flexible production schedule to accommodate potential delays. Those are things that you can do. I mean, if there is any question up to that bit, of course, ask. So remember that we're just using probability to try and figure out the chances of a supplier or a certain risk event. In this case, the risk event was on-time delivery. In fact, the opposite of that, them delivering late. So that's the problem. So what are the chances that is going to occur? And if it occurs, what are you going to do about it? What is the probability? Now you have the probability, 27%. Well, what are you going to do about that? So if there is a question, again, ask. Let's move on. In this case, let's talk about analyzing a risk assessment and a risk register to mitigate risks in supply chain. Now, the idea is fairly straightforward, right? Once you have all those risks, you're not going to do much with them if you don't have a place where you keep them, okay? Like you record them and you come up with analysis based on the risks that you have. So these where something like a risk register come in. So you have a risk event. It's not one, number of them. And you put all of them in a risk register and then you come up with plans based on whatever you have in the risk register. So that's the thing, the underlying theme here, okay? Risks can come from many things. For instance, every time there's a new machine, okay, a new operator, a change in the form of transport, a change of location, an entry into computer system, a change in economic condition, or even a change in the weather, all those point towards some risk event. And in each of those cases, you have to ask yourself, what risk events are we expecting here? And what plans do we have for such? I'm not saying be paranoid. I'm just saying it's business. And yeah, well, the truth is only the paranoid survive, right? So in this case, that's the thing that we're talking about here. So let's start with the use of templates for risk assessment and risk register. Now, the risk assessment template as well as the risk register will make things easier if you have them. In this case, this provides the procurement professional with the ability to quickly identify, assess, and develop appropriate response to risks. And again, to avoid making this one sound so theoretical, here's an example of one. So in this case, we are talking about a supply chain risk assessment template, okay? And again, don't worry about, by the time you're done, you'll learn how to fill all this stuff in. So yep, what do we have here? You can have it's a template, right? So you can have your company's name, assessment date, and who's actually doing the assessment, all that stuff. So one, risk identification. Look, this thing can be one giant template. In this case, we've just broken it down into so that you can understand it easily. But it can be one big, long thing where you have risk identification and all these things just fall in one big table. So it doesn't have to be exactly the way this one looks like, right? But anyway, let's move on. So we have risk, okay, identification. So you have your risk ID, 1, 2. So these are the identification codes for these risks. So ID1 refers to which risk? Okay, disruption due to natural disaster. 2, supplier being bankrupt. 3 refers to cyber security breach. 4, political instability. And which areas do they affect? Well, the disaster affects your operation, financial, obviously, supplier bankruptcy. Cyber security breach will affect your technology instability. Well, probably stability or instability, depending on how you look at it. That's political and regulation. Sources, okay? Where are all these things coming from? And you have them. When were these risks identified? And you have all the dates. Now, identifying them is one thing. Let's talk about their impact and likelihood. So again, risk 1. What was risk 1? That one was disaster, natural disaster. So anyway, so all these IDs. Likelihood 4. Remember, we are scoring it on a 1 to 5, where 1 is less likely, 5 is very likely. The impact 5, which means risk score 20. What does that mean? It's very high. Okay. And then you continue all the way. So, medium, high. Just looking at the likelihood of it happening and the impact if it happens and the score. That is important because once you know that, okay, then it means you know when you're going to, like how fast you can act in relation to that risk. So the mitigation strategies for natural disaster, which was 1. Develop contingency plans, diversify supply sources, create disaster recovery plans, which we look at by the time you're done. Who's going to do that? The supply chain manager, okay? The same for all these one, conduct regular financial health and all that stuff done by who? Financial department or finance department. When is the deadline for doing all this stuff? You have them. Regarding monitoring and reviewing, how frequently do we do that? Okay. Quarterly method, we're going to have quarterly risk and all that stuff. So I'm going to add these as a template so you can go through it. That way you don't have to read everything here. We have risk communication. Okay, who's in charge of that? Obviously the risk, who are they communicating to? Senior management. Okay. Communication is going to be through quarterly reports. How often? Well, if it's quarterly report, then it's quarterly supply chain team. Communication, monthly, obviously. So all that stuff, you have that one, okay? And you help the people who are reading this one to know what does 1 mean, what does 5 mean. Again, in terms of score, anything that falls between 1 to 5 is low, 6 to 15 medium, 16 to 25 high. And you see that here when you're doing your score. How do you know this one is high? Because it's between 16 to, if you go back here, between 16 to 25. How do you know that something is low? Well, if the score falls between 1 to 5, like none, so you don't have anything that is low. Everything here is high. And so that's the thing with that. Now, let's move on. Let's talk about completing risk assessment and risk register. Because we've just seen that from the example, okay? Like you have a table and there is a score of 1 to 5. There is a score of like 1 to all the way to 20, like 25 in this case, okay? So what do those mean and how do we compute those and, all that stuff? Let's quickly talk about that because, again, as I said, as we continue, learn to do that. The risk register for starters can be used at various levels in the organization. For instance, the board level, the functional level, and the project management level. But the thing you need to understand is that these registers need to be currently updated. They need to be updated. Why? Because yes, you have impact and likelihood of something happening, but the factors affecting that thing, okay, the likelihood of that thing occurring may change, which means the impact of that thing also could change depending on the circumstances that you're operating in. And so that's the reason why, your supplier, okay, your supplier going bankrupt. And then what is the impact? Say the impact is 5 on a scale of 1 to 5. Why? Because we are depending on that one supplier. But in this case, let's say you're depending on 2 suppliers and one supplies 80%, the other supplies 20%. The 20% suppliers not being able to supply, the impact is not going to be overall 5. Why? Because you still have another one who's supplying 80. So the point is, these things they keep on changing, which is the reason why you need to constantly update those risk registers, constantly update the strategies that you have, because if you change something in the register, it means you're also going to have to change something as far as the strategy is concerned. Depending on the size of the organization, you can have a team dedicated into looking at such risks and making updates where need be. But either way, whether you have a team or not, the underlying points of references are going to still be the same. In this case, the overall impact of the risk is always going to be equals to impact factor times probability factor. And as we mentioned, you can then decide to score these ones in terms of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, where 1 is very low, 2 is low, and 3 medium, 4 is high, 5 is very high. For example, the overall risk event, that is X, can be 15. Okay? And in this case, we're talking about 3 being the impact factor and 5 being the probability of that thing happening. And so in that case, when you have 15, what does 15 mean? Again, you'll have to come up with a score for that. So maybe 1 to 5 means low, 6 to 15 means medium, 16 to 25 is high. These are things that you are putting in your risk register. But your risk register won't just be consisting of a risk event, its impact, likelihood, and then the score. So there are other things that you also need to include there, which will include things like risk identification number, the date the risk was raised, okay, who raised it, review date, okay, risk description, causes of the risk owner, as well as mitigation measures. So the point here was just for you to be in a position to feel those things. Now you know, okay? Look, the way you design it can differ, but the underlying principle is just the same. You're just saying there's an event and what will happen if that event occurs, who's going to communicate, who's going to do what. Basically just coming up with that plan. So let's move on. Again, learning by doing. So let's have a quick practical tests and then we move on. So in this case, imagine you are the supply chain manager for a company that manufactures electric bikes. Your company sources components from various suppliers across different countries, including batteries from South Korea, frames from China, electronic components from Germany. Recently, the company has been experiencing supply chain disruptions due to various factors. What exactly do I want you to do in this case? So in this case, here's what I want you to do. So here's the question. Using the scenario above, create a simple risk register for the supply chain of electric bikes manufacturing company. Identify at least 5 potential risks, describe the impact and likelihood of each risk, and suggest a mitigation strategy for each. So that is what you need to do. And look, if you're stuck, again, just ask. This is just learning by doing. So you're just testing your skills to see if you really know. Because if you're taking these for exam purposes, cool, then you do your exams, then you pass, because, there is that. You ace your exam. But then there is still the question of, now you learn the job or now you start your own business and you need to put these things in practice. So just test your capability to practice these things and see how that goes. Now, let's move on to the next thing. In this case, let's talk about engaging stakeholders in the development of risk assessment and risk registers. And the first thing you need to remember here is that supply chain doesn't just occur in a vacuum. Okay, you don't be like, I'm the procurement, and then, no. All that stuff happens somewhere. And in that place it's happening, there are other people who can affect or be affected by whatever is happening in the supply chain. These are the stakeholders. Okay, so stakeholder is anybody who can affect or be affected by the events that are happening, in this case, in the supply chain, or anywhere in business. So they are stakeholders, right? And you want to involve such persons in the risk identification and assessment when developing your risk register. Why is that important? Why do you need to involve these people? Well, first of all, it depends on who these stakeholders are. But the idea is working alongside stakeholders who may need to expose vulnerability in their own operational system will require the procurement professional to develop their interpersonal skills to deliver clarity of communication, a safe environment to discuss sensitive issues, consensus-style decision-making, and a coaching style of management. And look, I really don't want to think of it this way. The Mendelow's matrix, is a very good idea for you to learn how to deal with stakeholders, because in that matrix, you're going to divide stakeholders into 4 quadrants. So you have the key players, the sort of that just need to keep informed, the ones that you need to keep satisfied, and all that stuff, right? So you're going to use that. This is the reason why you need to understand how the Mendelov matrix works. And if you're thinking, well, how does it work? Well, there's a video on that, probably going to link it here. But the idea here is just identify your stakeholders as far as that supply chain is concerned. So it's not like if you're going to be talking to some shareholder somewhere because they have a stake in, not really. It's just, in this case, you're talking about stakeholders from that supply chain point of view. And what are we concerned with in supply chain at this point? We are concerned with the risks. So that's the thing here. Anyway, let's move on to the next thing. Let us explain the development of risk management culture and strategy to improve supply chains. When we talk about culture, we're talking about way of life, okay? And in this case, we're talking about the way of life in an organization, because culture is the way of life generally. So in this case, you're just looking at it from an organizational culture. Now, what about risk management culture? Risk management culture can be characterized as a supply chain in which supply chain actors believe, discuss, behave, and operate in a manner that has risk management at its core. You need to look at the sort of way things are happening in an organization and identify tools that can help you, from the way they are behaving. I mean, each organization has its own way of doing things. In some organizations, they just assume anything to do with supply chain is going to be taken care of by the procurement department, and then we don't care. All right? But then there are those organizations where everything is just connected to everything else. And so the culture there is going to be totally different. But some of the tools that can help you in this case will include things like dual sourcing, That is, ensuring that alternative sources for key materials are identified to reduce supplier criticality risk. Number 2, asset sharing. That is, cooperating with other organizations, including competitors, to share physical assets, including manufacturing plants, distribution centers, transportation, in order to benefit from economies of scale, even at a local market level. And look, think of it this way. Let's say you are it's a construction company, okay? And then you are sourcing elevators, lifts. Then it means if you only need 6 of them, all right, and this particular supplier that you're dealing with also has another client in that area who also want elevators. So are they just going to supply 6 to you and maybe 10 to that person if they're in a position to actually supply 16 using the same logistic route? The answer is no. They're going to do it once and then maybe separate them at delivery level. So in that case, it's just asset sharing. So in some cases, companies will just do that. It's like if you're importing something and then you have a container and then the container is going to be half full. Then you tell somebody else, why don't you just use the other half so that you can use one container and cut back on the costs. So that's part of asset sharing, and it's part of managing some of these risks, and it depends on the culture that the organization has. Next, recognizing base demand, that is using data to calculate predictable base level demand, which can be planned for, and managing surges through postponement techniques. Of course, rapid manufacturing is another one, where you utilize new technology to develop the flexible capacity to manage surge demand. And let's talk about international standards for risk management, such as ISO 31000 and ISO 28000. And with globalization, what is happening? It means that most companies are sort of trying to standardize, okay, to ensure that whatever they are doing has some form of standard, because that makes it easier to regulate these things, which is where things like ISO come in. So you want to be certain that if you are importing something from supplier A and supplier B, who are in 2 different countries, they supply the thing that you want and not 2 versions of the same thing. Again, this is where, as I said, ISO comes in. And to start with, ISO 31000. So ISO 31000. Now the ISO 31000, that is Risk Management Framework, is an international standard that provides organizations with guidelines and principles for risk management. And with this particular standard, there are 3 components, okay, which are important. And in this case, we're talking about risk management principle, risk management frameworks, and risk management process. So let's look at all these quickly, and let's start with the first one. So the risk management framework. Now the risk management framework, okay, which is the first of the 3 components in ISO 31000 basically. It's a guide, okay? So it's basically just a guide that is supposed to help organizations when they're coming up with their framework as far as supply chain management risks are concerned, or supply chain risk management is concerned. So in this case, we have leadership and commitment, meaning what? Meaning the top management should ensure that risks management is integrated into all aspects of the organization and demonstrate commitment by providing adequate resources. And when we talk about adequate resources, it means competency. That is an example, okay? So competency is also an example of an adequate resource. And not just competency in the sense that the workers are supposed to be competent, even the top management, okay? Number 2, integration, that is risk management, should be part of the organization's process and not just something you think of when you see the procurement team. So it should be reflected in things like organizational goals, governance, leadership, and commitment strategies, objectives, and operations. Number 3, design. Okay, so design the framework for managing risk, considering the organization's external and internal context. And that is going to be reflected in things like risk management policies, risk management guidelines, okay, risk management implementation roadmap, as well as work plan and budget for risk management, Number 4, we have implementation, meaning what? Meaning implement the risk management framework and process. 5, evaluation, that is evaluate the effectiveness of the risk management framework. And 6, improvement, which calls for continuous improvement. Now let's look at these from a practical angle. Let's look at the ISO 31000 practically. So in this case, let's imagine that an electronic company, okay, manufacturer, so in this case, let's call them ABC manufacturer, who rely on a global network of suppliers to provide key components for the smartphone the company manufactures. So in this case, the suppliers are going to be, obviously, part of the supply chain. And the supply chain, okay, will include raw materials from Asia, semiconductors from North America, and assembly in Europe. So the company has recently faced disruption due to geopolitical tension and natural disasters, prompting it to adopt ISO 31000 framework for better risk management. Now, how do they go about doing that? That is a thing, right? So in this case, number 1, establish the context. So the company starts by figuring out what are its internal and external risks. So they're figuring out the context in which they operate on. And that will mean assess internal capacity of the procurement, logistics, and production teams to manage supply chain risks. Understand external market conditions affecting suppliers, which in this case could be things like geopolitical issues, trade regulations, technology advancements, etc. Number 2, risk identification. And that means coming up based on all that, right? So what are some of the risks that you've identified? Maybe the suppliers are likely to go bankrupt. Maybe that's a risk. Maybe there is an issue with the, like obsolescence in terms of the semiconductors you're using. I mean, come up with all those risks. Next, risk assessment. And we know, okay, at this point you know that. This is where you do your probability and impact, come up with the score and all that stuff. Okay? Next, risk treatment. And regarding risk treatment, you can go with risk avoidance, which could actually mean not doing the business. Risk reduction, for example, deciding not to depend on one supplier so that you're not just, if that supplier has a problem, you're stuck. Risk sharing, okay, where you can share the risk with third parties. That is what insurance are for. Or you can tell the supplier to show you that they have a guarantor. So that's another way. Next, you can also have risk acceptance, in which case you just say, yeah, we know that risk, okay? And we're okay with it. If it occurs, we'll deal with it because we're in a position to deal with it. Now, number 5, monitor and review. This calls for regular risk audits. And finally, communication and consultation with all relevant stakeholders. Now look, the ISO 31000, okay, so 31000, is built on the following principles. Number 1, risk management can create value. Number 2, risk management should be an integral part of management. Number 3, it should be part of decision making. Number 4, risk management should explicitly address the uncertainty faced by an organization. Okay, it should be systematic, structured, and available at the right time. It makes use of best source of information. Number 7, it is tailored to the organization. 8, it should take, okay, number 8, it should take into account the employee and organizational culture. Number 9, risk management should be transparent and include all departments. Number 10, risk management is dynamic and updated regularly, okay, and it responds to changes in the organization and its environment. And finally, it facilitates the continuous improvement of organizational process. With that, now you're in a position to understand the risk framework, the ISO 31000 risk framework, the process, as well as the principle. If there is any question anyway, you ask. So let's move on to the next one. In this case, let's talk about ISO 28000. Okay, ISO 28000. That's it. Okay, so 28000. And in this case, it specifies the requirement for establishing, implementing, maintaining, and improving security management system, including the aspects relevant to the security of the supply chain. So this one is pretty much about security in the supply chain. So when you see ISO 28000, just think securities in the supply chain. Okay, that's the thing here. Now, organizations are continuously facing security risks, and that seriously threatens the operations. Now, high-value products are prone to theft, confidential information is prone to hacking, and personnel are prone to injury. And all these things are going to either result into a financial loss, or they could just result into a legal consequence. The PDCA model is a good way of dealing with all of these. How does that thing work? Okay, so here's how it works. Number one, we have P, which stands for plan, which means what? Establish security policies, objectives, target, control, process, and procedures relevant to improving security in order to deliver results that align with the organization's overall policy and objective. Do, that's the D, implement and operate the security policy, controls, process, and procedure, and then check, meaning monitor and review performance against security policies and objectives, report the results to the management for review, determine and authorize actions for recommendation and improvement, and finally act, meaning what? Maintaining and improving the security management system by taking corrective actions based on results of management review, okay, and reappraising the scope of the security management system and security policies and objectives. So that's the thing. That's the policy that you use there. The P, okay, D, C, A, meaning what? Plan, do, check, act. Let's look at that from a practical angle. In this case, ABC, let's assume a company, let's call it ABC. So ABC Electronics designs and manufactures electronic components. And the company sources raw materials and components from suppliers all over the world, okay? And the security thing, how does it come in? So in this case, step one is to plan, and that means conduct gap analysis and risk assessment, which will mean performing a comprehensive assessment of the current supply chain process, identifying vulnerability and threat, which could include theft, counterfeit components, or even geopolitical disruption. And from the results of that process, you develop supply chain policies that could include things like supplier vetting procedure, okay, secure transportation methods, and incident response protocols. Step two, do, okay, so plan and then do. In this case, it will involve the supplier selection and evaluation policies, and if need be, delivering training programs focused on secure packaging, transportation, and handling of sensitive materials. Now, the security controls, like introduction of tamper evidence packaging, GPS tracking for shipments, and enhanced cybersecurity measures, also help in this stage. Now, number three, so plan, do. The third one is what? Check. Okay, so what are you checking for? Here's where monitoring for compliance takes place. And if there is any issue, then you act on it, which is the last step. And the last step, what was the last step? The last step was act. Okay, that was the last step. Now let's sum all these up by looking at some of the benefits of ISO 28000. And these will include things like, number one, facilitate trade and expedite the transport of goods across borders, monitor and manage security risks through your business and supply chain, gain a competitive advantage and win new business. Number four, it encourages companies to secure their own process within supply chain. And number five, reassure stakeholders of your organization's commitment to the safety of individual and security of goods and services. So that is important, okay? So now you know there is ISO 31000, which is all about supply chain management risks. There is ISO 28000, which is all about security in the supply chain. So these are things that you need to understand, of course. If there is any question, as always, you ask. So let's move on. Let's talk about the risk management process. So at this point, again, just to remind you, you are aware of how important supply chain is to your business. And in fact, practically, if you just look around you, everything, I mean, you said this, everything that you have, okay? Well, most of the things that you have got there as a result of the supply chain, some aspect in the supply chain, your laptop, your phone, okay? So you didn't just wake up and it materialized. There was some logistic activities involved, which was part of supply chain. All of which just points to why managing supply chain risks is important. Recent development in the supply chain strategy are focused on the introduction of flexibility and agility in the supply chain to enable the organization to balance cost effectiveness with responsiveness to customer needs. And there are several ways in which organizations can go about this. For instance, by integrating operations, maintaining a close manufacturing distance, avoiding overproduction, leveraging real-time inventory data, etc. And again, from a practical example, let's see how these work. And to start with, let's assume that we are dealing with someone who's manufacturing designer clothes. So let's go with that, okay? So that's a business. What's a business? Manufacturing designer clothes. And in this case, number one, they can go with vertical integration. So the designer can choose to control most of its supply chain from design to manufacturing to distribution. Now, that integration will allow the company to quickly make decisions and implement changes without relying on third parties. Because look, if you are in charge of manufacturing, but then you have zero control over the distribution, then that means anytime you want something to be changed in the distribution, you have to have a meeting with those people and hopefully hope that they comply. But if you're controlling the entire process, vertical integration, again, keep on doing that. So vertical integration, then everything makes sense. Number two, reducing the manufacturing distance. Now, a large part of the clothes could be produced close to the company's headquarters. This will help to shorten transportation times, as well as enabling rapid response to market trends. So the company can have a responsive inventory management system that allows for quick adjustment to inventory levels. And all this just comes down to how good your risk management process is. And we know, so at this point, we know some of the stages that will be involved in this case. Some of the stages involved in the risk management will include things like establishing the context, which means you first of all have to know the context in which you're operating under, identifying the risk, we know all that stuff, right? You identify the risks involved, and that means looking at the risks in terms of, you just make a list of all those risks. And next, are they internal? Are they external? That's important. And this is where something like a steeple analysis will come in, where you're looking at, you're trying to assess organization, right? So you look at it in terms of social, technological, political, ecological, economic, and legal environment. That we figure out the external risks. And internally, something like a SWOT analysis will also help you. Strength, weakness, opportunities, threats. That will also help you to analyze the risks. Now, moving on, analyze. So now you've identified the risk and you've analyzed them and you've evaluated the risks. You choose to treat. Now, when it comes to treating risks, it is important to understand something here. There are 4 T's which are going to guide you as far as treating risks are concerned. And these 4 T's are: number one, you can tolerate, which means these are risks that you can accept. You can treat, that is risks that you can minimize the impact. You can transfer, and that only happens in case where you look at a risk and decide, this one I'm just going to use a third party. Or you can terminate, where you just choose not to go with the whole project. And so those are the steps in the risk management process. And the final step actually is to communicate. You keep on communicating with stakeholders. So what are the steps here? Quickly, we have establishing the context, identifying the risk, analyzing and evaluating risks, treat, and then communicate. So what are the advantages? What advantages does risk management process give you? And the advantages will include, number one, the risks are more likely to be identified and therefore less likely to affect the business as usual. Number two, the process is well managed and constructed with all stakeholders understanding their role that they should play. Number three, businesses are more likely to achieve the strategy that they are aiming for. And finally, continual improvement means that the organization is continually refining the process so that it is as efficient and as effective as possible. So, let's move on to the next one. In this case, let's talk about the resources required to achieve improved risk management in supply chain. And look, the first thing you need to understand is that the resources you need when it comes to risk management will, for the most part, just depend on the sort of organization that you are, like the size of the organization, the kind of risk you're talking about. So it's not like if there is just one thing for every organization. So that's the first thing you need to know. Broadly speaking, resources will include capital, material, or people required to manage risk within the supply chain. And the capability of a company to survive a risk event will just come down to whether they have the resources required or not. Okay? For example, in case of a cyber security threat, the resources depended on are likely to be computing hardware, software, and the expertise knowledge to defend the technology infrastructure from cyber attack. And we also have things like rebuilding warehouses, production facilities after some natural disaster, which will also depend on the ability to secure building material, architectural methodologies, and labor resources. And all those ones will just call for proper risk management plans in place. This is the reason why some organizations, depending on the kind of organization you're running, right? Some organizations will just have departments that are focused, or will have personnel whose job is to keep on looking at the risks, which also depends on the risks you're talking about. Okay, for example, banking sectors, insurance, companies that deal in oil and gas. I mean, these are sort of organizations that there's always a risk around the corner. In banking, there is always people who are going to default. In insurance, the same thing can happen. In oil, explosions and things of that nature. So it means those ones, okay, risk management is not a leisure. It's just part of everything you do on Monday, all the way to like Friday, depending on how long you work. So it's part of the organizational way of doing things. So the point here is, with resources, you're just talking about whatever you need. And what you'll need, again, will just come down to, one, the sort of risk that you've identified, and two, the kind of company that you are, or the industry, or the market, whatever, that you operate in. So it's not like if what is needed here is going to be needed in this other company. Right, so now let's move on to something else. And again, as we continue, keep on repeating. If you have a question, make sure you ask. Now let's compare strategic approaches to mitigate risks in supply chain. Now when it comes to managing supply chains, especially issues dealing with like security, okay, and those sort of threats, you'll have to consider whether strategic decisions regarding sourcing, contract commitments, supply partnerships are justifiable in relation to maintaining the security of the supply chain if there is a threat of, the loss of the supplier. And this is where you start thinking of alternative supplier, or you need to come up with a sourcing strategy. Now, speaking of sourcing strategies, because if you're dealing with suppliers, then it means sourcing, right? So the sourcing strategies that you can have in place or that you can go for will include the following. Number one, dual sourcing, okay, where you have two suppliers and supplying the same thing, right? So in this case, what are you talking about? For example, a primary supplier could provide 70% of microchips needed, and a secondary supplier provides the remaining 30%. Apple, for example, often uses dual sourcing for key components like memory chips and displays. And so these are, you have some of these things coming from Samsung. Okay. Yeah, Samsung does provide those things to Apple. Okay. Or they can source from, it's Samsung and SK Hynix, which also could supply to Apple. So that is dual sourcing. And then you have number two, multi-sourcing. Now in this case, you are increasing the number of suppliers. So it can also involve some form of global trading arrangement. Google, for example. So Google, for their data centers, might source server, networking equipment, and other hardware components from several suppliers, including Dell, HP, Cisco, and other manufacturers. Number three, you have geographic sourcing. And in this case, you're just saying that you're going to choose where you're going to source your suppliers from, or rather you're going to source these goods from, based on the advantages that their geographical location will afford you. So that can mean going far because it's safe, or staying close because you're in control. For instance, Volkswagen, so VW, sources parts from different regions to ensure a steady supply to leverage local expertise. They source electronic components from Asia, steel and aluminium from Europe, and certain specialized parts from North America. This way, if there are issues to do with geopolitical tension and stuff of that nature, you can bypass those by just using that other country or that other country. So that's the advantage when it comes to geographic sourcing. Now we also have strategic sourcing, and in this case we're talking about a targeted approach to procurement. So you're not just buying things. There is a method to the madness. Okay? Strategic sourcing is used to assess potential suppliers and internal organizational supply needs. So you see a lot of these in something like category management. What is that? So in this case, we're talking about goods that have, say, similar characteristics, or, something like that. So the way you categorize the things that are being supplied. Samsung strategically sources components by diversifying its supplier base while maintaining strong relationship with key suppliers. For example, Samsung can source memory chips from multiple suppliers, but also produces its own chips, ensuring supply security and cost control. And then finally, you have ethical sourcing. And in this case, we're just saying that you're not just going to be sourcing because you're trying to control costs. Okay, you're also going to look at things like the way people are being treated. So you have those sort of labor relationships to worry about. You also have things like environmental, factors to. So in short, all the problems that could be ethically related to, the process. So you're trying to take those ones into account. So that is the thing with ethical sourcing. And it's important because, these companies that will set up manufacturing bases in countries where the labor standards are next to zero. And then there is like child labor and all that stuff. And then it comes out and suddenly people are boycotting those products. So you're trying to avoid those sort of problems. And that is why ethical sourcing is also a big deal. So those are some of the 5 strategies that you can use when it comes to sourcing. Which are they? Dual sourcing, multi-sourcing, geographic sourcing, strategic sourcing, as well as ethical sourcing. And now let's talk about developing risk management strategies to mitigate risks. And the idea is simple. Once risk has been identified, scored, prioritized, the procurement department must develop risk mitigation strategies. And the risk mitigation strategies could be things like, in this case, increasing inventory, contingency funds, additional capacity, inspections, etc. And the success at this rate or at this stage will depend on things like the organizational culture in relation to the risk that you're dealing with, So if they just assume, risk management, supply chain, that's procurement, you don't care about it, that's a problem. But if it is something that is shared across the entire organization, everybody knows that they have a role to play when it comes to things like those ones, then it becomes easy. For example, something like currency fluctuation could affect several departments. It could affect purchasing department when looking to buy raw materials, production department when buying machinery, and finance department as it receives payment. So the solution here could be something like, let's go with other currencies, But, or it could be something like, let's just hedge. So hedging is also a solution that can occur. But that only occurs if it is something that the organization actually thinks it's a problem and they're working towards fixing it. Otherwise, it just becomes something that you just say, the market is bad and all that. Except that there's something that you could have done about it. So speaking of currency fluctuation and hedging, here's a practical example. Now, imagine a US-based company, so ABC Corp, and the company imports some of its equipments, from Japan. So they have a supply in Japan. And so they have to pay that supplier using yen. So US, they use dollar, Japan, they use yen. So that's the thing, Let's assume that the company has to pay the suppliers 100 million yen in 3 months. Currently, the exchange rate is 1 USD, so $1 is equals to 100 Japanese yen. So 100 million yen is equivalent to $1 million US. That's easy, right? I mean, it's fairly straightforward. Now, let's introduce some problem here. If the yen strengthens over the next 3 months, for example, the exchange rate becomes 1 USD is equals to 90 Japanese yen, the payment would then cost ABC Corp $1.311 million US, increasing their cost by $110,000. So here's where hedging as a strategy, in this case, can come in. And what does that mean? So to protect against the risk, ABC Corp can enter into a currency forward contract. So this contract allows them to lock an exchange rate today for a transaction that will occur in future. Okay? Meaning what? Meaning they can go to a bank and say, look, here's how much we're going to give you. We need to get into a contract which says that in the next 3 months, we're going to buy 100 million worth of yens from you guys at $1 is equals to 100, okay? 100 Japanese yen, so something like that. So they're saying, let's agree now that in future when it comes, we'll buy this product for this particular price. And yeah, 2 things can happen. In fact, 3 things can happen. The yen can go up, it can go down, it can remain where it is. So both parties to this deal are actually, in fact, let's continue. So ABC Corp enters into a forward contract with the bank to buy 100 million yen in 3 months at a rate of 1 USD is equals to 100 Japanese yen. And again, as I said, 3 things can happen. But in this case, what are the results here? So what could happen here will be something like this. 1, the yen strengthens, that is 1 USD is equals to 90 Japanese yen. So at this point, without hedging, the company pays 1.11 million USD. With hedging, the company pays $1 million, okay, as per the forward contract, because that is what they're going to buy the currency for from the bank, and then they just pay. Okay, so they just spend whatever they are planning to spend. Now, the reverse can also happen, meaning what? The yen weakens, that is $1 USD, okay, so 1 US dollar is equals to 110 Japanese yen. So without hedging, the company pays 909, okay, 1,091 US dollars. So they gain. But with hedging, they still pay $1 million US, missing out on the potential saving. So the point here is that if you are hedging, it doesn't really mean that you're always going to win. You're just saying that I'm taking a bet on the future. Okay, this thing is likely to happen and it will cost us. So let's get into a deal which says we are going to stick to this contract. So if the price goes up, we'll buy at this price that we agreed on. If the price goes down, we still buy at the price you agreed on, and the seller in this case gains. Okay, and you see this in commodity market, like somebody's buying coffee and then they say, I'm going to buy this number of coffee, the bags of coffee at this price in future. So if the price goes up, they pay the price they agreed on. If the price goes down, they still pay the price they agreed on. So the buyer gains, the seller gains in this case. So that's a strategy that can be used. I mean, there are a lot of strategies, but that was just an example. In addition to things like increasing inventory, setting aside some funds to mitigate the risks if they occur, things of that nature. Right, let's move on. In this case, let's talk about preparing a contingency plan. Now, first of all, what exactly do you mean by a contingency plan? Now, this refers to a system-specific planning process using a standard methodology to determine critical activities that will take place in the event of a risk event occurring. Okay? Like if there is a cyber attack, what are you going to do? If your systems aren't working in the production, what are you going to do? Okay? If some of your employees decide to go on strike, or all of them decide to go on strike, what are you going to do? If there is some geopolitical tension, if there is natural disaster. So you're coming up with a contingency plan for all of these. And that could look something like this. So in this case, we have an example of a contingency plan, okay? And yes, I'm going to put this in the download so you can access it. Anyway, look, for example, here you have, just a minute. So we have resources, okay, that are likely to be affected. So these are the resources that are likely to be affected. The length of time that the supply chain can operate without those resources, the impact okay, of that event occurring and those resources not being available. Why are you even vulnerable? Okay, so which areas are you going to be suffering from, and what's the plan? So take something like IT infrastructure. If an event occurs, maybe earthquake, whatever it is, and it knocks out those things, okay? So how long can you survive without them? 3 days. What's the impact? One, there is no visibility of demand and supply, okay, requirements, and that can lead to something like inventory mismanagement. And why is that happening? Because we've just lost our ERP functionality. So what's the contingency plan here? What's the plan? Well, use paper reports and telephone communication in the next 3 days, because we'll be out for 3 days, okay? And so basically manual process, okay? That's what you're going for. Number 2, what if we are missing out on facilities? Like they're done. How long can you survive without those ones? 0. Why? Because you're not going to manufacture anything, okay? Vulnerability, poor maintenance of equipment, and so, or even the fact that you are closer to a river, so flooding, and then facilities are out. So what's the plan here? You can use secondary warehousing options and plan to salvage equipment and restart operation. What about your workforce? If you don't have them, 0 days to survive. The point is, this plan kind of just explains, like step by step what is going to happen if certain events occur. Like how long can you last without your workforce? How long can you last without your supply partners? Maybe 30 days, okay? And why? Because, we're just depending on this one. So what's the solution? Find an alternative, okay? Something like transportation, okay? Or even utilities. How long can you go without them? And then, how long you can go without them. What will happen, okay? What are you going to suffer from? What makes you vulnerable, like in the case of utilities, the fact that you don't have a generator, or you're not going to have water supply. And so you just have to organize for those ones to be available. So this is an example of a contingency plan, which looks at resources, how long you can go without them, the impact if those things aren't there, areas that are going to be vulnerable, and the plan you have in place to take care of all of that. And that is the thing with the contingency plan. Now let's move on to the next one, because we are sort of just finishing this. So you're looking at some of the plans that you need to have in place. So let's talk about the next one. In this case, let's talk about preparing a business continuity plan and a disaster recovery plan. Now, even with all the challenges that can occur in the supply chain, things like natural disaster, cyber attacks, okay, it is important for you to ensure that the business still continues. That is why you need a business continuity plan. So it's not like if there was a cyber attack and therefore we have to shut down the business and we are done. That simply means you never thought that that thing was going to happen. So what was the point of risks identification? It means you just didn't see that coming. No, why didn't you see that coming? Because if you are dealing with computers, then one of the things you have to know is that at some point there could be a cyber attack. If you have employees, then you should be in a position to see that one day these people could just go on strike. What's the plan for that? If you have a warehouse, so what happens if that warehouse is inaccessible? Being prepared for a disaster is not only ethically sound, but also good business sense. And knowing that is one thing. Doing it is another thing, okay? So just knowing that we need to have a plan. Coming up with that plan is a totally different thing. The development of a business continuity plan and disaster recovery plan requires the organization to assess current preparedness within the supply chain, including the business continuity strategy, the role of the supply and procurement function in the planning process, what methodologies are used, and who has responsibility to maintain and update the plan. So the process will always start with the normal things, right? Risk identification, figuring out the likelihood of those things happening, the impact if they happen, all that stuff. And then the business continuity plan goes a step further and examines how to keep the organization operational and restore critical business functions that are time critical throughout the supply chain. Now, the 4 areas that you need to pay attention to. There are many areas, but the 4 areas that you need to pay attention to when you're developing your business continuity plan, okay, will include areas like loss of facility, okay, This may be as a result of flood, fire, chemical contamination. The point is the facilities just become inaccessible. So that is something that you need to think of. What will you do if that happens? Number 2, disruption in operations, okay? Technology disruptions, or even organizational issues. Because these are some of the areas that are going to be largely impacted if an event occurs and now those things are no longer there. Continuity and recovery planning considers the business impact in terms of the length of time that a disaster will interrupt the supply chain, actions to respond to that interruption, and a determination of recovery window. And the recovery window in this case is the process of recovering and restoring supply chain operations to normal. What are some of the elements, okay? What are some of the elements of business continuity plan? And in this case, we're talking about things like, number 1, awareness. That is the recognition of supply chain risk exposure and the potential consequences of such disruption. Number 2, prevention, which will include the identification, assessment, treatment, and monitoring of risks in the supply chain to reduce the exposure of supply chain risk events. Number 3, remediation. Where the risk cannot be eliminated, the organization will need to develop plans to reduce the duration of disruption and minimize business impact by identifying in advance any resources required to carry out the continuity and disaster recovery plan. And then number 4, knowledge management. Okay, this is where you look at the whole experience and ask yourself, what exactly did we learn from this entire thing, so that in future we have a plan if that thing happens again. At this point, it's worth noting that the difference between business continuity plan and disaster recovery plan is a subtle one. The point is the business continuity plan, okay, will sort of just identify things that you need to look at and mention them. But then the disaster recovery plan, which is part of the continuity plan, okay, the business continuity plan, will go further and talk about if this event occurs, then is what you do before that, is what you do during that event, and is what you do after that event, okay? So it will have each disaster and everything that you're supposed to do about that. In fact, let's look at a practical example of the business continuity plan in this case. So here we have an example of a business continuity plan sections. And what do we have here? So we have, so we have the sections and the description. So for example, there's the purpose of the scope, which describes exactly what this thing is all about. So in this case, describes the purpose of the continuity document in terms of how the supply chain, because this is all about supply chain anyway, how the supply chain will support the business venture. So we have plan, activation, and notification, meaning in this case, how the magnitude of the risk event will be assessed, okay, in case of something like a ransomware attack, okay. So how do you do that? And so if you look at an event like this, you see this is something we mentioned, and then you're going to have a disaster recovery plan that will have details of all that. So the chain of command in the supply chain responsible for activation of the plan, the communication, okay, how the plan will be activated, so like internal messaging and all that stuff. And what if instructions for emergency plan, okay, what will happen if direct contact in this process fail? So a plan like that one, okay? And then you have scenarios and assumptions, okay, like the risks, which you can obviously get them in the risk register. Okay, the scenario plan, okay? We have plan maintenance, we have plan testing, because you need to run all these tests and drills, right? So here's an example of the plan. Again, you can access this. So that's the point there. And again, as I said, this is totally different from something like a disaster recovery plan. Now, let's look at that. Let's look at an example of a disaster recovery plan. So in this case, you're going to assume that there is a flood, right? So that's the thing. We're assuming that the disaster in question is, in fact, a flood. And there are three things here. There is prior to the flood, there is during the flood, and there is after the flood. So what do you do before the flood? Since it's part of the risk that you anticipate, okay, you're going to review the business continuity plan, okay, with the key employees, identify things like where power is or fuel tank, how they're supposed to be shut off, okay? Storage procedures, insurance policies, and all that stuff. Now, during the flood, then what do? Well, prioritize preservation of life, implement the business continuity plan, okay? Listen to the news reports, okay? All this stuff. Unplug electrical devices or hardwares, evacuate employees, right? Retain employee, this is an important, that's very important. Retain employee and supply partners contact information. Why? Because remember, we still have a business to continue doing. After the flood, obviously you're going to avoid contaminated areas because of electrical charges, okay? Beware of infrastructure degradation like weak roads and stuff like that. So all this stuff, the point is there was a plan before, during, and after. And this particular plan is going to be, you see, with your, what is it called? With your business continuity plan, it will mention these, all right? And then now here are the details regarding that. So there are all these risks. So it depends on the organization. That information can be that big. I mean, it sort of just depends on the sort of organization that you're working with, the kind of risks that you are dealing with, and all that stuff. So that's it. That's the end of this. Okay. If there is any question, you obviously ask. And so the idea is that you should be in a position to now understand issues to do with supply management or the supply chain risks. So issues to do with managing supply chain risks. If there is any question you ask. Yep, I'll see you in the next lesson.